What's up, gamers? I hope everybody's having a wonderful day today. So this is just going to be my end of the year retrospective. I did the same thing last year, and what this is going to be about is I'm going to talk about all the games and notable DLCs that I played throughout 2024. Now, a game doesn't have to have released in 2024 for me to bring it up. My only criteria is that I have to have first meaningfully played it in 2024. I will also not count early access titles since they're not finished yet, although I don't think I played any new early access titles anyway, so who the fuck cares? Which, this was mostly a backlog year for me, because there weren't really that many new releases this year that really caught my interest. But enough beating around the bush. Anyways, let's go ahead and get right into this. So the first game we have to talk about is Super Mario Bros. Wonder for the Nintendo Switch. The first 2D Mario game in quite a while, and succeeding the new Super Mario Bros. Series, which got quite repetitive. But Mario Wonder thankfully does not fall into that same pitfall. The art style has been updated and looks quite nice, but still looks very much like Mario. Controls are tight and feel excellent to use, which is incredibly important in a platformer. There's the badge mechanic, which gives a variety of different abilities and bonuses as you play, but the game feels quite balanced to the point where any of the badges feel viable. But the real star of the show here is the level design. It is so fucking good. Even within the same worlds of the game, the levels all feel very distinct from one another, and I honestly can't think of a single one that I didn't like. But by far the coolest aspect are the power seeds. Basically, when you pick one up, they cause the level to go completely fucking insane, completely changing how they play in very unique ways, and they are always fun to find. Honestly, this might be my new favorite 2D Mario game, replacing Super Mario Bros. 3. Really good game and solid recommend. Up next, we have Armored Core 6: The Fires of Rubicon. I've never really played a mech game before this, but overall, this was really fun. Combat is fast and kinetic, and the game is structured around smaller missions, which is quite interesting. The game is quite challenging, and I find the difficulty curve to be pretty good, though not quite as refined as something like Elden Ring. And I like all the different options you have to customize your mech in terms of different weapons and armor pieces. Although one pitfall I will say is that some missions definitely prefer certain damage types over others, but you usually won't know that until you actually play the mission. Although if you die, you do have the option to customize your mech before respawning and trying again. Some of these levels do get creative, like one, you have to hide under some of the level geometry to avoid artillery fire. Others have you climbing a giant mammoth in the desert. And just combat in general feels like a lot of fun. Story-wise, I wouldn't really say is anything special, although to be fair, I haven't completed the game yet. I don't really remember the names of any of the characters, but it seems to be decent enough in terms of justifying the action here. I'd say more, but I stopped playing around like after the second act. And it's not because the game wasn't fun, it definitely was. It's just that the next game that I'm gonna talk about was also something I got at the same time, and I wanted to try that out, and I just ended up sinking more time into it, and frankly, I'm not sure why I never came back to this game, because it genuinely was a lot of fun. Of course, I might end up getting sucked back into it, because if I recall correctly, I need to go back and get gameplay footage of it for this video, so who knows. But yeah, Armored Core 6, really fun game, solid recommend. Alright, so next we have a bit of a twofer, that being Resident Evil 4. Now, around this time is when I first played the remake, but later in June, I played the original game, so I'm going to talk about both of them here since I want to compare and contrast the two. For context, RE4 Remake is the first Resident Evil game I've ever played, whereas by the time I got to the original, I had also already played 5 and 7. How's the story? Well, I found it to be quite entertaining in the original. While it wasn't the most rock-solid writing out there, the game also had this very campy presentation to it, and gave me the sense that I wasn't really meant to take it too seriously, and instead it focuses on being straight-up entertaining, and I think RE4 succeeds with flying colors here. I get the sense that it's supposed to be a parody of the action game genre, and there are many moments where I just bust out laughing because of how funny it was. The main plot is pretty simple. Leon Kennedy gets sent to look for Ashley, the president's daughter, only to find out that both he and the president's daughter have been infected with a parasite and they have to remove it, otherwise they'll both turn into Ganados. There's also different varying side plots here, which I all think work well enough. When it comes to the remake, however, I unfortunately find that it wasn't quite as good as the original. I still think it's alright, but there weren't as many of those moments that got me laughing like there was in the original. And some characters, notably Ada Wong, Ramon Salazar, and Lord Sadler, got toned down and are kind of boring in the remake. And while there were moments that still made me laugh, there weren't quite as many as there were in the original, and keep in mind the remake had the advantage of being the one that I played first. However, I will say there is one area in which the remake is better, and that's with Luis's character and his side plot. They greatly improved that over the original, and I think Luis is actually my favorite character in the remake for this reason. So when it comes to the story and presentation, the original I think is a better experience than the remake. But as we all know, gameplay is king, and on that front, there's no contest. The remake is simply better. The controls in the original absolutely suck. Now, for context, I actually did play an emulated Wii version until I bought the Ultimate HD edition on PC, and playing this game with a controller is an absolute pain, which I really don't understand why, considering that this game released 4 years after Halo Combat Evolved standardized dual analog for shooters on console. Instead, the game uses tank controls and this semi-awkward aiming scheme. At least the game is balanced around these control limitations, thank God, but it just results in the game feeling less like I'm fighting the enemies and more like I'm fighting the dated controls. Thankfully, there is a saving grace here, that being the RE4 Tweaks mod for the PC version, which gives you something closer to modern shooter controls for keyboard and mouse, and for this reason, I would recommend playing the PC version with this mod installed on keyboard and mouse if you want to experience the original. Which, this mod also fixes a few bugs that resulted when they ported this game over to PC. Another control issue is the lack of any D-pad or number key shortcuts for weapons, so every time you want to switch weapons, you have to stop the game to open your attaché case and manually switch weapons, which becomes quite a pace breaker, especially in later encounters where you're going to want to be swapping weapons often. The remake, however, has the standard dual analog controls that you would expect, as well as the ability to move while aiming and firing, and you can also strafe. There's also weapon shortcuts on the D-pad or number keys, which allows for more fluid combat. Beyond that, the remake has something that the original sorely lacks, and that is actual resource management. Now, RE4, both the original and the remake, fall more towards the action horror side of the spectrum, so I don't expect resources to be quite as limited as something like, say, RE7, but I still expect to have to manage resources and ammo appropriately, otherwise the game will punish me. In RE4 original, however, you get absolutely showered with ammo to the point where you pretty much never have to worry about managing it properly. In fact, on my PC run, when I got to the castle, I literally had about 164 pistol bullets, 48 shotgun shells, 20 rifle bullets, and about 170 rounds for the TMP. And that was in addition to what was already loaded into my guns. Honestly, if it wasn't called Resident Evil, I'd question if RE4 Original was even an action horror game at all, because not only is it not scary, but it also lacks real ammo management, which is typically something you'll see in most survival horror titles, which includes action horror games. The remake did it so much better. Your ammo is limited to the point where you need to make meaningful decisions about when you'll use certain types of ammo to clear encounters, otherwise you'll be punished with other encounters being harder, but it's also not suffocatingly strict to the point where I feel like I can't pass the encounters at all. There's also a crafting system here where you can craft different types of ammo. It's not overwhelming or anything, but it does add a nice amount of decision making, like do I craft more rifle ammo or more SMG ammo. The resource management in the remake just adds some decision making to the gameplay that I feel like the original just lacked. There are some more things I could mention, but that would be dragging it on too long. Of course, I should say it's not a zero-sum game either, because one thing I will say is that the remake does cut content from the original. Of course, it also adds more content of its own to make up for it, but there are some areas in the original that are not present in the remake, and some of them are really cool. Like, by far the best boss from the original is not present in the remake at all. So because of things like that, as well as the story, there is still reason to go back and play the original, even if you've already played the remake. What I will say though is that both games are really fun. I like how dynamic the combat is, especially with enemies mutating as the fights progress. And while I have heard complaints about Ashley, both in the original and the remake, as far as escort quests go, she's actually not that bad. Ultimately, both the original and the remake are really fun, with the remake I think being better overall, but the original having an edge in some areas, most notably the story as well as some of the cut content. If you can only get one of these two, I'd go with the remake, but if you can get both, I'd say it's absolutely worth it. Next up, we have Baldur's Gate 3. Now, I should note, I'm not really an RPG person, and I probably would not have tried this game out for myself if it wasn't gifted to me. By the way, Big Country, if you're watching this, thank you very much. So what do I think of it? Well, from what I've played of it, it's actually a pretty good RPG. There are a lot of characters you meet, they seem pretty fleshed out, and I like the way that the different members of your party interact with each other, which is something I feel like a lot of games that I've played just don't really have. Starfield! You get lots of different options to customize your character, which, I saw that the default name was Tav, and I decided to name my character Tav the Slav, which just made it absolutely hilarious every time I introduced myself to an NPC. I find that turn-based combat in this game is a lot more engaging than in typical turn-based RPGs. If you've ever played a turn-based tactics game like XCOM, it's kind of similar here, although it does have more RPG mechanics like initiative values. Not quite as deep as a tactics game, but that makes sense since this isn't a turn-based tactics game, it's an RPG. And from what I've seen, it seems like a really good RPG. However, I can't really say I got too much enjoyment from it. Like I said earlier, I am not an RPG person. What often happens with me in RPGs is I play the game for a few hours, think it's interesting, but then I sort of drop it, play something else, and then I just can't get back into it. And that is exactly what happened with Baldur's Gate 3. I really wish I could have gotten more interested into this game because from what I've played, it genuinely is a well-made game. And I did try to get back into it, because I realized that I didn't have any gameplay footage of it for this video, so I figured I'd use that as an excuse to boot the game up again, and I tried again for another couple of hours to get into it, but I just couldn't. And I do kind of feel bad for that, because this was actually a gift to me from another person. Although, at the very least, I do have Steam family sharing enabled. My brother was able to try it from my library, and he absolutely loved the game, which he somehow managed to get working on a GTX 960, even though that is actually below minimum spec. But I just wish I could get into this game myself. So my verdict is that this isn't really the kind of game for me. I didn't enjoy it myself, but if you like RPGs, I would wholeheartedly recommend it. Next up, we have some DLCs. Now, I'm a pretty big fan of the Bioshock games, but early this year, I came to the realization that, wait a minute, these games have DLCs and I haven't played them. I need to fix that. There's not really much to say about the challenge rooms in Bioshock 1, they're just whatever. There's also the Protector Trials from Bioshock 2, which those are just a bunch of protect the little sister while she harvests Adam, using a different assortment of weapons and plasmids on different maps. There were some weapon combos that I actually think were cool and creative, like the one where you have only plasmids, or the ones where you can only attack indirectly. But there's not really much else to say about them other than, whoop-de-doo, they're fun, let's move on. Minerva's Den in Bioshock 2, however, is a lot more substantial, as it's a story-based DLC. And frankly, I think Minerva's Den might not just be my favorite piece of Bioshock content, but I also think it's now my favorite piece of gaming DLC ever. It takes place after Bioshock 1 and 2 in a place of rapture called Minerva's Den, with the plot revolving around this supercomputer called the Thinker, which was created by CJ Porter and Reed Wall. Porter wanted it to use its personality emulation to basically bring back his dead wife, whereas Reed Wall saw the potential to make a lot of money with it, and so it naturally led to a conflict between the two, which resulted in Reed Wall taking over Minerva's Den and CJ Porter being imprisoned by Andrew Ryan under false charges. By the time you actually reach it and the DLC starts, you play as Subject Sigma, who is guided by CJ Porter in order to defeat Wall and take back the Thinker. I really love the story in this DLC. I like how Bioshock 1's story screws with your head, while Bioshock 2's story screws with your emotions. Well, Minerva's Den manages to screw with both. I love how it explores more of the lore of Rapture, as well as shows the power vacuum with both Ryan and Lamb gone. And while I don't want to spoil the ending, it was pretty much perfect, in my opinion. Gameplay-wise, it's also pretty great. It takes the excellent foundation that Bioshock 2 had and just expands on it further. I like the way the upgrade system changed. This DLC is only about 2 to 4 hours long, so instead of getting weapon upgrades from the Power to the People station, you just find weapons and weapon upgrades out in the world, kind of like a Metroidvania. And I also love just how open-ended the DLC feels. I don't know if it's explicitly more open-ended than the base game, but it definitely feels that way. In fact, on my first playthrough, I somehow managed to miss the machine gun somewhere. There's also the new ion laser weapon. It's really fun to use, runs out of ammo pretty quickly, but is pretty powerful. And the new gravity well plasmid, well, does exactly what you think it does, and that's also really fun to use as well. Great DLC, would absolutely 100% recommend, though make sure you play both Bioshock 1 and 2 before playing this. Since I was already on a kick of Bioshock DLC, I figured I'd also play the Burial at Sea DLCs for Bioshock Infinite. Now, for context, I was not a huge fan of Infinite's base game. The story was a complete train wreck, and the gameplay was just decent, but had a ton of missed potential. But maybe the DLCs could improve on that. So how's Burial at Sea Part 1? Well, the gameplay doesn't quite reach the same level of quality that Bioshock 1 and 2 had, but it is a substantial improvement over Infinite. It returned to a more survival horror style that Bioshock 1 and 2 had, with ammo being a lot more limited and the player being able to carry every weapon at once. On top of that, it even found a way to get the skyhook and tear mechanics from Infinite's base game working, which is great because those were two things that I actually really enjoyed about Infinite. There's also a really cool hidden weapon that you can unlock by exploring and solving a few puzzles, and while I don't think I'll ever replay Infinite, I could see myself replaying this DLC. However, there are some issues. Even though there's no weapon limit anymore, there are no keybinds to quickly switch between weapons. It instead uses Infinite system where it swaps between the last two weapons you had equipped, which worked in the base game because there was a 2-weapon limit, but here it means you have to use the weapon wheel, which just feels like a pace breaker and is not as intuitive as I would have liked it to be. I also find that while money is restrictive, I actually think it's too restrictive because you get a lot less of it like you did in the first two games, but it also keeps the mechanic from Infinite where you lose money every time you die. And because this is a lot more challenging than Infinite's base game, I found that I pretty much was not able to buy any of the upgrades from the vending machines and could only occasionally afford to buy more ammo. Also, much like Infinite's base game, health kits and Eve hypos are still instant use upon picking them up, rather than being something you can hold onto and use at any time. Which I think is a misstep, seeing as it is going for a more survival horror approach like the first two games. So while it doesn't quite reach up to Bioshock 1 and 2 standards, the gameplay is still pretty good. The story, however, is less good. I like being able to see Rapture before the fall, but then there's the ending, which, for one, makes absolutely no sense within the context of Infinite's ending, because it sort of plays off of that. But on top of that, when it reveals the motivations of a certain character, it makes their actions through the entire DLC make no goddamn sense. I understand you can't tell the greatest story ever, given that this DLC is only about like an hour and a half long, but I at least expect it to make sense within the context in which it exists. Well, what about Part 2? Well, it's a dumpster fire. Part 2 takes a look at the steps that Part 1 made with its gameplay to improve the experience, and decides to throw all that out the window in favor of being a stealth game. The way I describe Part 2's gameplay is like Dishonored, but bad. Now, there are some improvements I should note, like, for example, you now actually have keybinds for different weapons, and on top of that, you can also carry health kits and use them at will, although this unfortunately does not extend to Eve hypos. And I thought they did a good job adapting the skyhook mechanic for the more stealth-like approach, but the rest just sucks. At the beginning of the game, you're given a plasmid called Peeping Tom, which lets you see enemies and mechanisms through walls, which that's fine and all, but its charge ability turns you completely invisible, which is kind of game-breaking in a stealth game. Even more so when you later get the upgrade that makes it so it doesn't consume any Eve whatsoever if you're standing still while using it. And sneaking around is pseudo-required due to the absolute nerf to your combat ability, which on one hand kind of makes sense since you play as Elizabeth instead of Booker in this DLC. It makes sense that her fighting prowess doesn't match Booker, who is a grizzly war veteran. But then you have shit like nerfs to weapons like the hand cannon and the shotgun, which not only are their handling reduced, but also they have nerfs to their damage and ammo capacity, which makes no goddamn sense. But then you get a crossbow which can kill or knock out enemies in one shot anyway, so like, what was even the point? They also removed the tear mechanic, which sucks because that was one of the best parts of Infinite and Part 1. And the gameplay of Part 2 overall just sucks, even more than Infinite's base game, which even then I already wasn't a huge fan of it, but at least it was kinda decent, at least to the point where I actually wanted to finish the game. But Burial at Sea Part 2, I genuinely do not think I would have finished this if it wasn't as short as it was. How's the story? Well, it's awful. There's this voice in your head that's supposed to be a representation of your inner monologue, except for the fact that it gives you information that you absolutely should not be able to have. And another major issue is that it completely retcons a lot of the lore from the first Bioshock. Like, for example, there's this really cool moment where we see the Suchong audio log from Bioshock 1 play out before your eyes, but even that's a fucking retcon. I'd go into more detail and give more examples, but I don't want to spoil this too much for those that haven't played it and want to. But what I will say is that they decided to connect connect Columbia to Rapture, which is absolutely stupid because the base game made it very clear that Columbia and Rapture took place in separate universes and were largely unconcerned with each other. But then along comes this DLC which has to intertwine the two, which completely fucks the lore from the first game. This DLC's story is just offensively bad. Like, as bad as Bioshock Infinite's base story was, at the very least, that was its own thing, so it didn't poison the lore of the other two games. But Burial at Sea Part 2's story does poison the lore of the other two games in a really bad way. So yeah, fuck this DLC and fuck this game for killing the series. Alright, next we have the Star Wars Battlefront Classic Collection. Now, I already made 2 videos going over all the issues with this in detail, one before it released and one after, so I'll keep it brief here. This collection takes the original 2 Battlefront games that were finished, unfinishes them, and then sells them again at 75% more money than it would cost to just buy the originals individually on Steam. All the collection adds is just porting over a few maps from Battlefront 1 and the Battlefront 2 and adding the 2 heroes that were previously exclusive to the OG Xbox version. Oh, and you can play Hero Assault on all the maps, but that's basically it. All of which has been modded into the original years before the collection existed. The one saving grace that this collection could have had would be revamping the online multiplayer, but unfortunately, that was absolutely fucking broken. Of course, that was back at launch. Maybe they've patched it since then. Let's take a look at the player count and see how that's doing. Not very well, it seems. Single player has also been made worse than the original due to a myriad of issues like broken AI, downgraded UI, and many others. Battlefront 1 and 2 are great games, and I would highly recommend them, but this collection is absolute ass, and I would just recommend buying the originals on Steam instead. Next, we have another Resident Evil game, and this one is Resident Evil 5. I decided to play this game in co-op with my brother around March or April, and then later I got the game again on PC and played through it in solo. Here's how I'd describe it. For the first 3/4 of the game, it is like RE4 original, but better. Controls are improved as you can actually strafe, and the button mappings make a lot more sense, although it unfortunately does keep the awkward aiming scheme from RE4. And unlike RE4, you actually have to manage limited amounts of ammo. And you can't just blast everything indiscriminately without regards to ammo consumption like you could in RE4. Which is nice considering that's one of my biggest criticisms of RE4 original. However, when you get to about the 75 to 80% mark, all of a sudden the game decides it wants to be a third-person cover shooter in the vein of Gears of War, and with these aiming controls, it just does not work. And before you ask, yes, I tried it on keyboard and mouse, but it's somehow way worse than playing on controller. See, again, during the first 3/4, combat is centered around having a bunch of enemies try to surround you and attack you with melee. Maybe you have a few guys that might shoot at you with crossbows or throw grenades, but you're given a fair shot at avoiding them. And then the last quarter is like, okay, here's a couple guys with AK-47s all shooting at you, all while we have several guys with the shock rods try to force you out of cover. Which, I think these would be fun in a Gears of War game, but with Resident Evil 5's mechanics and controls, it is a nightmare. But the first 3/4, absolutely fucking fun. Now, I have heard a couple complaints about this game, one of them being that it's not scary, and yeah, Resident Evil 5 is not scary at all, so if you want actual horror, you're not gonna find it here. Personally, though, I didn't really have an issue with that. The other common complaint that I hear is your co-op partner's AI. This game is designed for co-op, and so if you're playing in single player, the co-op partner is still present, but is AI controlled. And everywhere I go, I see people complain that this partner AI is absolutely terrible, that they constantly get themselves killed and waste a ton of resources. And if I'm being honest, this has got to be one of the most overblown complaints I think I have ever seen thrown at a video game. Of course, I should note that I was playing on veteran difficulty, so maybe the situation is different on professional, but in my experience, the co-op AI is actually not that bad. Now, don't get me wrong, playing with an actual person in co-op is a better experience, since they can actually strategize, but I found that the AI-controlled partner was surprisingly competent. Outside of set pieces which forces you to split up, they tend to stick next to you, they have good aim, and they tend not to get themselves killed in stupid ways. Now, sure, it's not flawless. A few criticisms I do have is, one, they tend to use healing items a little bit earlier than would be optimal, but that was pretty easy to work around because I would just hold on to the healing items unless I had an overabundance of them. And the other was in one and only one boss fight at the end of 5-3. The way that fight works is that there are two opponents, so your co-op partner will distract one so you can deal with the other, but sometimes they'll just get themselves killed during that fight, and if they're on the other side of the arena, then tough luck. But besides that, there really wasn't that much to complain about here. The AI partner wouldn't really waste ammo. In fact, if you give them an automatic weapon, they'll tend to single shot it, and overall, I had a really fun time. The story I find is just alright. I think the character interactions are cool, like I love the dynamic between Chris and Sheva, both of them are really cool characters. Josh is a fucking homie, and the villains were all comically evil, but in a self-aware sort of way. It has a campy vibe to it that, like in RE4, I found pretty entertaining. This game is definitely not without its issues, but it's still a fun game that I would recommend, especially if you have somebody to play with in co-op, but even in single player, it's still quite a lot of fun. Up next is actually one of the few new releases that I played this year, an indie game called Sker Ritual, which has a very heavy inspiration from COD Zombies. In fact, the way I describe it is like a mix between COD World War II zombies and Black Ops Cold War zombies, but better than both. It has this early 1900s aesthetic and plays quite similar to COD Zombies. The gameplay mainly uses Black Ops Cold War as a base, but it does make a few improvements that ultimately make it play better than Black Ops Cold War. The most notable of which is this thing called Challenge, something Cold War sorely lacked, and what Sker Ritual has. You start each game with nothing but a pistol and have to work your way up from there. Another thing I like is something that this game actually borrows from COD World War II, where each map actually has two main quests. There's a casual main quest, which the game will guide you through, and there's a hardcore quest, which you have to solve on your own. Or you can just look up a guide on YouTube. And I will say that this game definitely feels a bit more quest-oriented than COD Zombies, with some of the quest steps being required for main progression, but like I said, the game will kind of guide you through that. Of course, if you want to ignore a lot of that and just survive, you can do that too. The game launched with 4 maps and has since added another 2 via free DLC, which is not bad considering it's only $25. There are also these miracle tokens which you get, which you can spend to upgrade your stats based on certain key areas, which I think is pretty cool, even if it is a little generic. However, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. This game does have some issues, several of which it copies from Cold War. For one, it has the same point system that Cold War does, which is disappointing. It also copies the Ethereum upgrade system for its perks, which sucked in Cold War because it led to power creep, but in this game it has the exact opposite problem where several perks are just straight up not very useful until you get them upgraded. Like Swift Death, which is this game's equivalent of Double Tap, only increases your fire rate by 5% by default, and you have to upgrade it 5 times just to get it to 33%. On top of that, while these maps have 2 main quests, they don't really have much in terms of optional side content, which means the maps don't really differentiate themselves quite as much. I also find that the weapon selection could stand to be better, and this also extends to this game's equivalent of wonder weapons. I think it could just use a bit more variety. And one other thing that I noticed is that if you're playing above 60 FPS, the animation work looks quite stiff, and there are a few other areas of the presentation that lack polish. But the most important part is that this game is fun. I wouldn't say it's amazing, and it definitely does not live up to some of the better COD Zombies entries like Black Ops 2, 3, and 4, but it is more fun than Cold War, and I would say it's a very solidly fun game. If you go into this expecting it to blow COD Zombies out of the water, you're going to be sorely disappointed. But if you keep your expectations appropriately tempered, you'll probably find an enjoyable experience here. And for the price, it's not too bad. And up next, we have yet another Resident Evil game. This one being Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Up until this point, all the Resident Evil games that I have played lean more towards the action horror side of the survival horror spectrum. Resident Evil 7, however, dials back the action and dials up the horror and leans more towards the puzzle horror side of that spectrum. And for this, I believe the shift to first person was the right move since it's more immersive, and immersion is a key factor when it comes to horror. Now, one criticism I do have is that this game has a pretty slow start. It takes about like 20 minutes to half an hour to get to something that I'd consider actual gameplay, and even then there's like another half an hour to 1 hour where it's very very much on rails. But once the game starts opening up a bit and lets you explore the house more freely, is when the game really starts to click for me. It plays similar to something like a Zelda dungeon or a Metroid Prime game, where I need to find a key or an item of some sort to progress, and then I have to remember where it is that I can use that item to move forward. Combat in this game is definitely a huge step down from 4 and 5, but I also get the feeling that it's not supposed to be as engaging as 4 or 5, rather it's more of a means to an end to sell the horror atmosphere. And in that case, I think it succeeds with flying colors. This game is pretty creepy. I also find that the Baker family is quite terrifying, and they make excellent antagonists. And the moments where they're chasing me, especially with Jack Baker, always has me on edge. Resources are also a hell of a lot more limited, which plays well with the resource management aspect for which Resident Evil is best known for. It really does sell the feeling that I'm just really scraping by, to the point where even just having a dozen handgun bullets or just 5 shotgun shells feels like I'm locked and loaded, because oftentimes I won't even have that. However, I do feel like the last portion of the game didn't really need to be there. What I'm talking about is that there's a flashback portion where you're given a machine gun and have to fight through several waves of molded. But then after the flashback ends, it doesn't take long to get that same machine gun, and then it just turns the rest of the game into a complete joke. The last portion of RE7 feels like it's trying to be an action game, but it's just not built to be an action game. The controls, enemies, and mechanics are built around small-scale puzzle horror. Combat worked because even though the enemies weren't super aggressive, you were also very, very limited in your capabilities. So now when the game tries throwing a bunch of the same molded enemies you've been fighting all game, but all of a sudden you have this machine gun with a shit ton of ammo, it just trivializes the last portion of it. And I really don't know why this chapter needed to exist, because around the 80% mark, I feel like the game could have just ended off there and it would have been fine. As for the story, well, compared to previous Resident Evil games, this one takes itself a lot more seriously. Basically, you get a message from your wife, who you've believed to be dead for about 3 years, telling you to stay away from a certain place. You, of course, then go to said place in the middle of Louisiana in order to try and save her. But while investigating, you get knocked out by the Baker family, who kidnaps you. You escape your restraints, but you still end up being stuck in the house. And then you learn from the only sane member of the Baker family that you and your wife have been infected with something called the mold, and that you need to rid it from your body, otherwise you won't be able to escape. That's the basic premise. Now, after beating the game and thinking about the story for a bit, I did notice that there were quite a few plot holes with this, and given that this story takes itself a lot more seriously than the other games in the franchise, I think it's a bigger issue here. Unfortunately, delving into them would enter spoiler territory, which I'm trying to avoid for this video. But what I will say that this game nails is the feeling of being a normal guy being thrust into a really horrifying situation and trying to survive. It was a vastly different experience from RE5 and RE4 Remake, but overall I had a really good time with it. Of course, since it is so puzzle-based, I'm not sure how the replay value would be to those other games, but that first time play experience was absolutely amazing. Up next we have a DLC, this one being Shadow the Erdtree for Elden Ring. Honestly, I've played games that aren't this rich and content-packed as this DLC. In typical FromSoft fashion, this DLC is much harder than the base game, but in a good way. Some of my favorite bosses were Rellana, Mesmer, Lord Midra, and of course, Dread Bale. Like I said, there's a ton of content, a lot of areas to explore, a lot of new items to find, and it's all really cool. There are a few complaints I do have though. For one, the performance in a lot of the Shadow of the Erdtree areas does tend to drop quite a bit. Second of all, some of the optional areas are just a bit more empty than I would have liked. In particular, the hinterlands and to an extent the Cerulean Coast are guilty of this. And of course, there's the final boss and ending. The second phase of the final boss is just way more irritating than it is fun. The first phase is not too bad, but the second phase, basically you need pretty much Herculean timing and precision, otherwise you are going to get your shit rocked. There's this one attack that he opens up within the second phase where I swear if you don't start running the very frame the second phase starts, there is no way to escape the blast. And then there's another where he charges at you multiple times, but I swear it's the most difficult thing to dodge, partially because there's a lot of visual effects that completely tank the performance down to like 20 FPS and I can barely tell what's happening. And the ending cutscene just left me more confused than anything else. Like, I literally had to look up on the internet to make sure that that was the ending cutscene and that I wasn't missing something. But even then, and it's not like I play Souls games for the story. But outside of issues like that, this DLC was absolutely great, and if you liked Elden Ring, I would definitely recommend picking this up. $40 might seem like a lot for a DLC, but the amount of content you're getting is more than worth it. Up next is a game called Squirrel Stapler. It's not a very long game, in fact I actually completed it within 48 minutes, but you know, it's a cute little hunting game, and it actually has a pretty interesting story. It was made by the same dude that made both Dusk and Iron Lung, so you know you're in for a really good time. Just give it a try, you know, it'll be a pretty fun time. Up next is a game called Ghost Recon Wildlands, which released back in 2017. My brother and I got it on sale because we were looking for a good co-op game. We are still looking for a good co-op game. This is basically the Ubisoft open world game of Ubisoft open world games. Like, it's not bad, but it's also not good. Actually, you know what it feels like? Third-person Far Cry 5, but worse in pretty much every way. Worse AI, worse weapons, and absolutely worse vehicle physics. These are probably the most jank-ass vehicle physics I think I've ever experienced in a video game. Frankly, I wish I was recording when we played it because the reactions that we got were absolutely priceless. Unfortunately, that initial reaction has passed, and it feels kind of cheap if we were to try to go back and recreate that. Because, I mean, we did get some ironic enjoyment from this, but I feel like if we were to ever play this again, we would have to be drunk off our asses just so we could, like, laugh at the absurdity of it. If you want an open world co-op game that you can laugh at and enjoy ironically, then go ahead and get this, but make sure it's on sale. But if you want an actual open world co-op game for unironic enjoyment, then I just recommend getting Far Cry 5 instead. Next up, we have Metroid Samus Returns for the 3DS, which until earlier this year was the only 2D Metroid game that I hadn't played. The reason for that is because the 3DS is a unique system with unique features, and I feel like I'd be doing myself a disservice by playing this on anything other than original hardware, unlike the other games where I don't really have an issue emulating them. And it wasn't until this year that I was able to find a copy for a decent price. My thoughts on this game are kind of mixed, to be honest. As a game on its own, I think it's pretty decent, but as a remake of Metroid 2, I feel like it really misses the mark. A good remake, in my opinion, should take the original game, make changes and improvements to fix any issues that were present in the original while also expanding on what made it great, while also staying true to the core of the original experience. And it's that last part that this remake really fails. It just does not feel like Metroid 2 at all. Compare this to something like Zero Mission, a remake of the original NES Metroid, which, while that game made a lot of changes and improvements, it still ended up feeling like Metroid 1. There's a very similar case with AM2R, which is actually a fan remake of Metroid 2, which also makes a lot of changes and improvements to make it play a lot better, but it still very much feels like Metroid 2. But in Samus Returns, outside of the story setup and the fact that the game revolves around you hunting down every last Metroid on SR388, it honestly just feels like a completely different game. If you took an area from Metroid 2 and then asked me to point out where its equivalent area was in AM2R, I could very easily do so, as well as vice versa. But if you showed me an area from Metroid 2 and asked me to show the equivalent location in Samus Returns, outside of like 1 or 2 spots, I don't think I'd be able to do it. I understand making some changes to the level design, but the thing is, it's completely unrecognizable. A lot of the subtext from the original is gone as well, which Metroid is known for telling a lot of its story through the subtext. In the original Metroid 2, there were fewer and fewer enemies the deeper you got, which showed the Metroids as being an apex predator. That's not really showcased in Samus Returns, though. I also don't like the way they changed the ending. I thought the way that it ended in the original, as well as AM2R, was pretty much perfect, but instead they decided to throw all that away for an additional boss fight, and it isn't even a particularly good boss fight either. Also, for some reason, they decided to use the last Metroid as sort of a key and lock puzzle to unlocking a bunch of optional upgrades at the end of the game. Not only is this probably the most egregious example of the endgame victory lap that some of the Metroid games like to do when going for 100%, at least in some of the other games, the way in which you use some of the items you get near the end of the game to unlock the final optional upgrades was at least kind of engaging, but here you literally just let the last Metroid eat the crystal so you can get whatever upgrade it is that you're trying to get, which is only really useful level in that aforementioned boss fight that I was talking about. But how was the game otherwise? Well, there's a bunch of new different mechanics that this game added that would later be expanded in Metroid Dread. I think free aim is really cool, though I wish you could also use the circle pad to angle your blaster up and down in an analog fashion like you could in Dread, but instead, unless you're using free aim, you're still locked to 8 directions as if you're using a D-pad. I also thought the addition of the melee counter was a cool concept, but the problem is pretty much every enemy has almost the same rhythm when it comes to actually countering them. Not to mention, it also stops your own momentum whenever you use it. Yet another thing that they improved greatly in Metroid Dread. I also think the Aeon abilities here are pretty cool and adds a nice element of resource management to the combat. And I also find it interesting that they decided to go with beam switching as opposed to beam stacking in this game, but I'd say they implemented it adequately. Another thing to mention is that this game is pretty fucking tough because enemies in the later sections can shave off as much as 2 to 3 energy tanks per hit. I think that's a little bit excessive given the kind of game that this is. I think it would make more sense if, say, this was more like Fusion, where it's a more linear experience, although, funnily enough, this game was actually pitched as a remake of Metroid Fusion before it was converted to a remake of Metroid 2, so that might explain a lot of it. But it does lead to a lot of frustration, because typically Metroid games are more about exploration rather than just straight up challenge in the combat. Now, I wouldn't really have minded this in like a hard mode, but I feel like in the normal difficulty, it's just a little bit too strict. Thankfully, the bosses are pretty interesting to fight, and one thing I will say that this game does well are the Metroid fights themselves. This is one of the biggest issues with both Metroid 2 and AM2R, but Samus Returns actually manages to switch up the Metroid fights enough so that they don't really get repetitive. Now, some of them are kind of frustrating due to the aforementioned difficulty scaling issues, but the fights in Samus Returns feel a lot more dynamic than in the other two games, and I really appreciate that. Exploration, though, is a bit of a mixed bag. Like, first of all, it's kind of hard to mentally map the game world because a lot of these areas look very samey. On top of that, it also feels like I have less freedom to explore than in both the original Metroid 2 and AM2R. Granted, this could change on repeat playthroughs, but it felt a lot more railroaded than those other two games. So overall, would I recommend Samus Returns? If you're already a fan of the series and just want to see what this game is about, then yeah, I would recommend it. However, I would not recommend it if you are new to the series and are looking to get into it, because the game's absurd difficulty curve at times might give people the wrong impression about what the series is really about. I also wouldn't recommend it to those that are looking to get the Metroid 2 experience, particularly when it comes to the more narrative aspect, because of how much it changes from the original and the fact that a lot of the subtext and nuance is completely gone or unrecognizable. Instead, if you're looking for that Metroid 2 experience, I would recommend either playing the Game Boy original or the fan remake AM2R. So around late summer, Modern Warfare 3 2023 released on Game Pass, so I decided to give it a try since I didn't buy the game for myself when it released. Now, I didn't bother with the campaign because, for one, I don't really play COD for the campaign, it's just something extra that I go through every year, and from what I understand, I'm not really missing anything by skipping out on this one. So, what's the multiplayer like? Now, I only played a few matches of it, and it was actually surprisingly decent. It wasn't anything amazing, mind you, but I did have some fun playing this. Problem is, it doesn't really differentiate itself that much from Modern Warfare 22. I mean, outside of the much higher time to kill. I mean, shit, most of the guns are directly ripped from that game, and your progression even carries over. And that's my main takeaway from the multiplayer. It feels like it should have been an expansion from Modern Warfare 22, but instead they decided to sell it as its own game. I mean, if somebody asked me if I wanted to play some MW23 multiplayer, I mean, I'd probably say yeah, but at the same time, I think I'd rather play Modern Warfare 22. But y'all know me. Main reason I wanted to check this one out is to see what zombies was like. And I am not even joking when I say I would rather be playing Duranfang from COD Vanguard. Yeah, it is that fucking bad. I only played one match of this, and 5 minutes into it, my immediate reaction was, I want to shut the game off and play something else. What they did for zombies in this game is they took DMZ from Modern Warfare 22 and just replaced the enemies with zombies. And that's literally what MWZ is. You wanna know why DMZ works? It's because the enemies can actually fucking shoot at you. That's not the case in zombies. Much like Outbreak from Cold War, you pretty much have a near limitless room to train. The structure is you run around the open world going from place to place doing random miscellaneous tasks to get money to extract with. You can only play this in squads, mods, and honestly, I just have to ask, why does it even matter if you die? Because after a couple seconds, you'll respawn right back in. Not like you'd be dying that much to begin with, because open worlds just leave you with nearly infinite room to train. Even when you go to a zone where you're not really supposed to be yet, and the zombies are super fucking tanky, they're not really all that dangerous. After I played Outbreak from Cold War, my takeaway was that zombies in an open world setting could work, but that Outbreak just fucked up its implementation. After playing Modern Warfare 3 Zombies, I no longer stand by that. I firmly believe that zombies just simply does not work in an open world environment on a fundamental level. I mean, shit, I think fucking Extinction from COD Ghosts would have worked better in an open world setting than zombies would. So yeah, zombies fucking sucks. If you're getting it for that, just don't even bother. Pretty much the only reason I can think of to get it would be the multiplayer, but even then, I think Modern Warfare 22 is just much better in that regard. Pretty much the only benefit this one has is that it's currently on Game Pass. Up next, we have yet another Resident Evil game, this one being Resident Evil 8 Village. This one was quite interesting. Gameplay-wise, it was pretty fun. What's interesting is that RE Village doesn't really fall into one specific part of the survival horror spectrum like the rest of the series. Instead, it has what I like to call the Resident Evil sampler, as it splits off into multiple different gameplay styles across different portions of the game. The first part of the game in Castle Dimitrescu is a puzzle horror game with a side of action, kind of like how Resident Evil 7 was. The second part in House Bienvento is a straight-up puzzle horror experience with no combat. And I gotta say, whoever designed this section over at Capcom needs to get a fucking raise, because I don't think any other section in the video game has terrified me quite like this one has. I'm not gonna spoil it, but if you know, you know. It was definitely really well done. Then there's Moreau's section, which in my opinion is the weakest part of the game. Not much combat and only one very easy puzzle. It's more like a platforming section, but hold the platforming. At least the boss fight here is pretty decent. And then after that, the rest of the game is a more action-packed romp, more reminiscent of RE4 and 5. Overall, I'd say the gameplay is quite fun, though I wouldn't say any of the specific aspects quite reach the heights that some of the other games do. Like, while I find the puzzle horror section in Castle Dimitrescu to be quite fun, I do think that Resident Evil 7 did it better. And while I do find the more action-packed sections of the last quarter of the game to be quite fun, I do think RE4 and 5 did it better. But the benefit of this structure is that the gameplay style is switching up enough so that the game never gets stale. One thing I will say though is that I wish you could tackle the four lords in whatever order you wanted, because story-wise I don't really see how much would change if you decided to go tackle them out of order. The only one that I think would really matter is that Heisenberg should definitely be done last, but I thought it was a missed opportunity to not let you tackle the other three in whatever order you want. I feel like that would have been really cool. Overall though, I'd say RE8 is really fun gameplay-wise. So, how's the story? No! What the actual fuck was that? While this game has some really good gameplay, the story is a complete dumpster fire. A lot of the actions of these characters just make no goddamn sense in context. For example, the game opens up with Chris Redfield showing up to your house, killing your wife, and stealing your daughter. Naturally, you'd think that this means he's your enemy. But he tries to make it clear throughout the game that he's supposedly on your side, but he wishes you to stay uninvolved. And once you actually hear the explanation as to why, it is incredibly fucking stupid that this explanation wasn't given at the beginning of the game, because it could have saved a hell of a lot of trouble. And if I were to get into spoiler territory, there are plenty of other examples I could give. Let's just say there are quite a few instances where the four lords could kill Ethan, but just choose not to for whatever reason. And there's also the fact that the merchant is now actually involved in the story, unlike in RE4 where he was solely a gameplay mechanic, which when you consider things like the fact that the merchant sets up shop within Castle Dimitrescu, you would think that the four lords would take the opportunity to kill him, but they just ignore him. And I could keep fucking going. And the thing is, I wouldn't really say any of the Resident Evil games that I've played have what I call Academy Award-winning writing. There are plot holes and inconsistencies that I can point out in all of these games, but the difference is older games like Resident Evil 4 and 5 were self-aware of this. Because of this, they had a much more campy, over-the-top presentation that made it quite clear that you weren't supposed to take the story seriously, and instead the enjoyment was more based on the entertainment value. The problem with Village, however, is that it wants you to take it seriously, and I just fucking can't with all of these issues. And here's the thing, you could also say the same thing about Resident Evil 7, but But the thing is, at least there, most of the issues with the plot didn't really become apparent until after I beat the game and started thinking about the plot of the game I had played. In Village, however, most of these issues were abundantly obvious while I was playing the game. So my overall verdict on Village is, it's really fun and I would recommend it for its gameplay, but if you don't really care about the Resident Evil gameplay and are just looking for a good story, I would skip out on this one. And finally, the last game I have is Call of Duty Black Ops 6. While Call of Duty hasn't exactly had the best track record as of late, I do think there's a lot to enjoy about Black Ops 6. The campaign is not one of them, unfortunately. The main issue with the campaign is, funnily enough, the same issue I had both with Black Ops 3's campaign as well as Bioshock Infinite. It introduces a bunch of really cool concepts, but then doesn't really do anything to really flesh it out in a meaningful way. I was actually kind of excited because the marketing toyed with the idea of a fugitive plot where you're on the run from the CIA, and the first few missions of the game's campaign do sort of set that up, but then they just do absolutely nothing with it. They also do this with several other potentially cool plot points. Like there's one with the character that you play as potentially having a deeper history to be explored, but then they don't do anything with that either. And hell, this trend even extends to the fucking ending, which has gotta be one of the most anticlimactic endings I think I have ever seen since Halo 2. The new characters aren't really all that interesting either. I mean, I kinda liked Felix with the idea of him being an ex-Stasi officer that became a pacifist to try and atone for his crimes, though I do wish this was taken further. But the rest of the new characters, you know, Harrow, Troy, Sev, they're just not interesting whatsoever, and I don't care about them. As for a lot of classic characters, they're here, but not particularly present. This is excusable in the case of Woods, since this takes place after the past missions in Black Ops 2, so he's confined to a wheelchair. But then you have Adler and Park from Cold War, who were really cool characters, especially Adler, but they're just not nearly as present as they should be. Park only shows up in one mission, and Adler, even though he's supposedly a central figure in this game's plot, you don't really see him all that often. Gameplay-wise, isn't anything to write home about. They did try to lean more into the espionage spy route that Cold War was going for, but I think they just leaned a little bit too hard, because it starts to feel like not a Call of Duty campaign. Instead, it tries to be sort of like a stealth ImSim in a lot of missions, but it can't go too far with it because it still has to be a COD campaign. Like, it honestly feels like they wanted to make a game in a completely different franchise, but had to adapt it for a COD campaign. In fact, there's even one level in this game where I genuinely had to ask if I was playing Call of Duty or Silent Hill. When there is combat, for the most part, it's standard COD fare, although you also have armor plates, and a few new enemy types, which would have been cool, but most of them are made insufferable because they are given armor, which takes like 2 to 3 fucking magazines to deplete. It's a shame too, because otherwise you got some really cool enemy types, like a dude with a riot shield, or a dude that sits behind cover and sends RCXDs your way, which ordinarily these would have been really cool enemies, but the fact that they have so much armor and it takes so long to kill them makes them absolutely annoying to deal with. Yeah, this campaign is really not that good. I wouldn't say it's the worst COD campaign ever, but I definitely would say it's in like the top 5 worst COD campaigns, so take that for what you will. How's the multiplayer? Well, it's actually quite a lot of fun. Omni movement is the big gimmick, and I actually think it works well. I like being able to dive or slide around corners to take enemies off guard. It's a really good counterplay to camping, and I do like that. I think the weapon sandbox is good for the most part. As for the maps, it's kind of hit and miss. Most of the main maps are pretty fun. I especially like Derail. However, you also have shit like Babylon, which is not only really small, but has some really fucked spawns. And speaking of the spawns, they also completely ruin Nuketown as well. And the main issue with the map pool are the face-off maps, which are really small and disable score streaks. These feel like they were designed for like 2v2 matches, kind of like the gunfight mode in Modern Warfare 2019. Why the hell are these in the regular rotation? They are way too cramped for 6v6. Thankfully, the rest of the maps pull their weight, but it's really annoying when one of these pops up. I'm also not sure how I feel about the combat specialties, because they have the potential to force people into specific playstyles instead of giving them the room to breathe, especially given how powerful some of these are, one of which just straight up gives you fucking wall hacks for a few seconds after you spawn. But outside of issues like that, I do find this multiplayer to be very fun, especially with the Omni movement. As for zombies, I already have a nearly hour-long review going over all my thoughts on that, so to keep it brief, if you're somebody that loved Cold War zombies because of its mechanics, then you're gonna feel right at home here. But if you're more like me and prefer Black Ops 2, 3, and 4, you'll still find something to enjoy here, though I don't think it quite surpasses those games. The maps are overall pretty fun, and the mechanics, while not perfect, are a huge step up from Cold War. My biggest issue with zombies, and I guess by extension this entire game, is the forced online bullshit. Not only do you need an active connection to play this game at all, including things like the campaign and solo zombies, but in the case of solo zombies, you can lag just as easily as you can when playing online co-op. And if you don't always have the best connection, then this can very easily be a deal breaker for you, and if you do suffer from poor connection, I would just recommend against getting this game as a result. So how would I recommend this game? Well, if you're looking for a good campaign, absolutely not. For the multiplayer, there is quite a lot of fun to be had, but there are some issues you need to be aware of. As for zombies, I'd say it's a pretty solid recommend, provided of course that lagging in solo is not a deal breaker for you. And with that, that covers all the notable games that I played this year. My favorite new release, what little ones I did play, was Shadow of the Erdtree for Elden Ring, as the rest of the new releases all had some quirk about it that held it back for me. As for my favorite game this year that I've played overall, I'd probably go with Resident Evil 4 Remake. I think it was just by far the best designed and most well-polished game that I tried out this year. But anyways, that's gonna be about it for the video. Make sure you hit the like button and subscribe for more, and tell me what games you played this year and what you liked and didn't like. Anyways, that's it. Peace!